I'm David Harradine. This talk is to mark the end of an exhibition of pinhole photographs which have been in the building for the last couple of weeks from a project called Stilled, which is a improvised durational dance performance which leads to the creation of pinhole photos. So we opened the exhibition with a performance at the studios on the 17th of March, a 7-hour performance. The photos in the building are some of the pieces that were made during that show, and this talk is to mark the end of the exhibition. When I was invited to host a talk as part of the exhibition, the brief was to just have a chat with some people who I was interested in chatting with about some things that I would like to chat about and that might hopefully relate to Stilled in some way. It's a totally impossible brief to just chat informally with some nice people in front of an audience who are sitting in chairs facing us. So thank you for coming. Welcome to my kitchen. I'm imagining I'm in my kitchen. It's Friday night. It's a beautiful evening. We would rather be outside in the sun, so thank you for being inside. And we're just having an imaginary glass of wine and chatting together. And trying to make some connections between three people's areas of practice. So the three of us who are talking with you, hopefully as well this evening, are myself. Bonnie Wallace, Professor Bonnie Wallace, who's Professor of Crystallography at Birkbeck College, University of London. And significantly for this setting, in a former life, practitioner of contemporary dance in the States. And Annie Cattrell, who's an artist. The plan for the talk is we'll go till about 8 o'clock up here. Then for anybody who wants to stay around for longer, there'll be a bar downstairs and we can adjourn to said bar and carry on chatting informally. My plan is for us to talk for about half an hour just to get some ideas out in the space, and then we'll have a little pause where anybody can become part of that conversation, and then I will come back to us three to talk a little bit more, and then we'll end again with all of us talking together. So just please bear with me on my opening up and closing down again moments through that. If and when you all want to contribute to the conversation later on, there's a roving microphone. The chat is being filmed for Siobhan Davis Dance's archive, so if you want to talk with us, just hold on until you have the mic in your hand before you start. I'll just start then just with a very quick introduction to what Stilled is as a project. I've said something already. It's a dance piece which leads to the creation of an exhibition of pinhole photographs. The context for the creation of the piece was a commission from the Wellcome Collection. Wellcome Collection is one part of the public engagement work of the Wellcome Trust, which I'm now going to try and say what that is in front of somebody who works for Wellcome Trust, but a science medicine funding body which has a really fantastic art commissioning and presentation program. So the Wellcome Collection was showing an exhibition about X-ray crystallography, the scientific process of X-ray crystallography. And I and my company Fever Sleep were commissioned to make some sort of live event inspired by X-ray crystallography, which would be part of a weekend festival during this exhibition. And we made Stilled. And the process of making Stilled really was about, as an artist, discovering things about crystallography as a science and trying to find connections between that scientific process, which Bonnie will talk more about. I'm not going to try and explain it, and my practice as an artist. And for various reasons, which hopefully will become maybe clearer over the course of this hour, Stilled was the piece that I wanted to make. And there are many threads running through Stilled, both the performance and the photos that come out of it, which for me very directly linked to the science of X-ray crystallography. So at its heart, it's a project which is both a performance piece and something which creates these visual ephemera, these artifacts, these photographs. It's a visual art project and a performance project, and it's a project which is an artwork, but which absolutely, I hope, grew out of and in response to and through a scientific process. So I guess that's a good moment to kind of lay our art science cards on the table. And I think, actually, I might ask Bonnie to talk a little about X-ray crystallography first, which is not what we planned. In the spirit of informal chats, we're not really planning it, so it's fun. So I'm just going to stop this. And yeah, Bonnie, if you could just give us a potted overview of crystallography and get us going on that front, that would be fantastic.
Okay. Only if you give me the...
Yeah, thank you.
Right. So I thought I was going to talk second, or third, actually.
Yeah,
so, and the segue into me was going to be that we were going to hear about art and light. And the first thing to say about X-ray crystallography is the first word, and that is X-rays. And X-rays are a form of light. You may all be aware of going to the hospital and getting an X-ray that will penetrate your body. But it is just a form of light that has a different wavelength than the form of light that you see all around you. And what we see is light of different colors. And what X-rays are is a light of a very, very short wavelength, but it is yet a different color. So X-ray crystallography derived from that because the shorter the wavelength, the more light can penetrate something. And so if you have very short wavelengths, and X-rays can penetrate through your body, and that's why you can see images like when you get a chest X-ray or something like that. But the other word is crystallography. And crystallography has the essence of it, the word crystal. And crystals are how we organize things to make them regular so that we can see something. Now, X-ray crystallography is a field that effectively started in the UK, and the UK was the home and the originator of it for many years. Birkbeck, where I am, is still the only department of crystallography in the world, but we are not the only people that do crystallography. There are thousands and thousands of people around the world that use X-ray crystallography as a method. It is an interesting tie-in with the dance because it is physics, and everybody says when you say the word physics, but it's physics looking for beauty in biology is how I describe crystallography. So what a crystallographer does is this. If we want to look at what a molecule looks like, so I'm really interested to see what a molecule of sugar looks like, or a molecule, in my case, of a protein. Here's a little advertisement for the Wellcome Trust. Our research has been funded by the Wellcome Trust in the past to do these kind of things because it's something that tells us very much about what a molecule looks like. Why would you care about that? Because molecules, when they go wrong, cause diseases. So I'm going to show you a picture at the end of something that's just hot off the press that we've learned about the structure of a molecule that is responsible for causing epilepsy, heart arrhythmias, and chronic pain. And by knowing what it looks like, we can now help to figure out how to solve diseases. So here's what a crystallographer does. We take a molecule and we make it into an object, usually a crystal, but we're going to talk just very briefly about something called a fiber. We shine X-rays on it and we get what is a diffraction pattern. Now the diffraction pattern is what is related to stilled, because it is when all the molecules are standing in one position relative to each other that they give rise to spots when you shine light through them. And ultimately, what we can use, if we have lots of fancy computers and maths, is to determine what the structure is of a molecule. Now, that sounds fairly boring, but, and maybe scientists are very boring, but for me, the process is wonderful because having gone from a beautiful crystal, I can look at what a molecule looks like in 3 dimensions. And the thrill of it is, and it's hard to explain, but there is a real thrill to know that you were the first person ever in the world through all of history to have ever seen that molecule and what it looks like. And that's an excitement because not only can we use it to help solve diseases, but we can use it to excite ourselves as to what it might tell us. So here's what we have. We have an object. This is just some little object. This is my protein. And I have one of them. And if I were to shine light on that, you wouldn't really see very much of anything. If I put it in a big bunch of molecules, so I've overlaid several of them in a non-regular way, that's a non-crystalline sample. And you also won't see very much, but I'll show you what that looks like. When you make a fiber, what you do is you line up these objects, 1, 2, 3, or thousands of them as it turns out, in a long line, and that's a fiber. And that gives rise to one diffraction pattern that I'll show you. If you order them in 2 dimensions, so instead of all in a line, if you make 2 this way, and 2 this way, and 2 this way, all in a regular pattern, that's called a 2D crystal, or a powder. And it's a powder if you line up several of them. But a crystal is that same 2D arrangement made into 3D, so that everything is perfectly lined up. And it's the perfect alignment of things that gives rise to diffraction. So when you see David's pictures, as I hope you all have, you will see spots and dark pictures. And they are related to whether there's motion or not in the molecule or the order of them. So there's something that's not crystalline. I told you I just put a whole bunch of things together in a random way. You get nothing on them. When you put them in the long line in a fiber, you get a pattern that looks like this. So now you can see regular spots. This is the most famous X-ray diffraction photograph in history. It was created by Rosalind Franklin, who worked out at King's College on the Strand, and it's a picture of DNA. This is what DNA molecules look like, and that gives rise to that pattern. Now that's exciting, and it was exciting when Rosalind Franklin, really the first woman practitioner in this area, saw this pattern because she knew she could learn about the structure. And ultimately, through the efforts of her and Watson and Crick and Morris Wilkins, they determined what the structure of this is. And for someone who is interested in molecules, looking at this beautiful double helix is exciting. And that's the excitement that I said you feel when you look at a molecule for the first time. Powders, sort of interesting, but a crystal is the most interesting thing of all. So here's a molecule. This happens to be a molecule that's an antibiotic. But it gives rise to this regular pattern of spots. And I think when David saw this, he recognized immediately that it looks like the kinds of patterns that he saw with people. And just to give you an idea of the process and why it is so interesting that Stilled is looking at moving molecules, here's what we do in crystallography. Last 2 slides. Motion is important. So here's a crystal. It's a teeny tiny little thing, fractions of a millimeter in size, and we shine an X-ray light on it, and we get this pattern. Now you can see there's some spots there, but not an awful lot of spots, and they're not very regular. So that's not very exciting for us. So this molecule, in this crystal, although it looks like a perfect alignment of molecules, is mobile, and you get few spots. On the other hand, if we have another crystal, and we shine X-rays through it, we get lots and lots of spots. These are exactly the same object, except things are mobile in this crystal and stable or stilled in this crystal. So more spots and less spots. And what we do as a crystallographer is we take those spots and we do a whole bunch of maths, which I won't bore you with, and what we get is what the molecule looks like. And this is it. This is the molecule that causes epilepsy and heart disease and chronic pain. And this molecule in this crystal looks just like this because it's still and it's not moving. But this molecule up here, there, hopefully, maybe this is going to work, and maybe it isn't. Yeah, there it is. What this molecule is doing is, during the course of when I'm shining an X-ray through it, it's not doing it very well on this computer, but I hope you can see that it actually does move like that. And that's what it's doing. And because it's doing that, we lose all those spots, and we get this. And so the relationship between mobile and stilled is the relationship between this now it's moving and I can't stop it. This thing moving and this thing staying the same. So that's my short lesson in crystallography and how it might relate to stilled.
Brilliant, thank you. I think there are lots of, that's really brilliant, the connections that you can make between crystallography and, stilled as a piece based in movement and a piece which explores the challenges of how you visualise movement and therefore visualise time. And there's so many things that you've mentioned which I think link to Annie's practice to do with light and the dimensionality of things, 2D and 3D structures and works and objects, and light. Light absolutely at the heart of crystallography, and I think it's been something, Annie, that you've worked with a lot, hasn't it?
I think.
I'll be here.
Great.
There's
Just that one, yeah.
So Annie's just going to talk again for a few minutes about her own practice, just to give a context for what we're then going to talk about.
Yeah, it's very nice to be invited to be part of this group and to come here. And one of the conversations that we had briefly about it was, about what I was going to talk about in relationship to David's work. And then when I'd heard that you were talking about X-ray crystallography, it reminded me of a residency I did in the Royal Institution, where one of the directors, William Bragg, I always get those two, wasn't there? There was a son and had developed X-ray crystallography, and I'd met his daughter and granddaughter or whatever. So there's a lovely connection there for me. But I thought I'd just show you slides of what I do and try and kind of show some and highlight maybe some of the things that I feel are pertinent, and maybe they can be expanded on or ignored, and we can focus in on something else. But one of the things that I've done a lot of over the years is work with scientists. I've had what I suppose I would describe as dialogues, conversations, read. My father was a medical physicist, so I was brought up in a family where X-rays were brought home, and he had this little device on his lapel, which was about how much radiation he'd got that day, and I'd want to pull it off and take it apart, and he'd tell me not to. And so it felt very normal to me. And so when I ended up in the Royal Institution, it felt like a fabulous kind of opportunity. One of the things that it was really lovely being there was I got the key to the front door. It's on Albemarle Street. It's a huge big building. It's just been refurbished. And I got allowed into the kind of back rooms, and this is one of the workshops, which I adored. This I just showed just to show the kind of interesting paraphernalia that was there, that I found really fascinating. So sort of molecules, an image of Faraday, something else, an old microphone and things. So there's all this, what I suppose I would rather vulgarly describe as gubbins. And I just thought, being somebody who makes things and is very interested in three-dimensionality, I find it very sort of evocative. I also watched Bryson Gore, who does a lot of demonstrations of science on, I think, Sky and things. And I won't try and describe what these are, but I found them really astonishing to watch. And he would do things like this, mainly actually to children. It was not to the adults. And I was sitting there watching these fantastic lectures. This one's called The Blue Devil. This is a bubble raft, so it's it's about surface tension and bubbles and how they want to pull together. And it was just that very, very simple thing of having a small tank, putting fairy liquid on it, and then it showed this fantastic sort of scientific physical phenomena. Made me, that whole thing about something very, very simple becoming something very profound, I found very interesting. This is called Why the Sky is Blue. And I got very interested in talking to meteorologists at the time, and Stan Cornford, who I've had dialogues and worked with over the years. We talked about cloud formations, and this is a recorder of wind, which I was looking at. And I like those kind of analog in relationship to the digital, in relationship to making, and all the way how you can gather information, scientific data, how things are measured, how you take something as a measurement and then you make it into something completely different and understand it and save some, improve upon the kind of some sort of disease or whatever. And then I got very interested I've always been interested in light, but I looked at this Campbell Stoke sunshine recorder, which is a device that's designed to record the sunshine on a particular day. And the sun goes through that sphere of glass and then burns a line which goes like this, and these are at each hour, and it burns the line, so the thickness, the intensity of the sunlight shown, and how long it lasts. So it's sunshine, not just sunlight, sorry. And I made a piece which was using that information, that data, and then laser etching it into sheets of steel. So it was like a kind of sunshine diary. And I like the fact that it was almost a bit like a fingerprint. It was only, it was a particular kind of rhythm of sunshine that could be seen at that particular moment in time. And these were the different kind of days. So it was laser cut right through. So this piece was called Aperture. So it was kind of, And I liked the rhythm, the movement was there. And then we talked about, I was really interested in how you could kind of recreate clouds, if it was possible to do that, because he was a meteorologist. And he'd made this device during the 1960s, which protruded out of a plane. And these little bits at the bottom here are just actual normal kind of cooking foil. And he put it on a device, like old-fashioned film, and let droplets kind of embed themselves into the foil. So very subtle, but just slight pressure, slight movement in, and then they'd bounce off, and then he'd twist it along. And so I started to try and recreate this in a dark room and sprayed water in the air and took flash photography with Mark Pinder, who's a photographer. And then I made this piece because I'm very interested in 3 dimensions. And this is 12 months of sort of average cloud formations in and around the southeast of England, where I live. And it's optical glass blocks, so it's almost like a sort of space that's very much there and present because it's so dense and it's optical glass, like microscope glass. However, it's transparent, so you see right through it. And it's difficult to document, but this is January right through to December. And this is what they were. So I put them beside each other, and I was really interested in how you can kind of compress time in the sense that you could show the whole year of potential cloud formations at one glance. You could see it. And in a way, that feels to me quite a bit how scientific data measuring is actually understood, and how people kind of compare and comparisons. And I've always loved that in sort of gathering information and having collections of my own of different things. So this is it. And I was very conscious of not to make any, like, sort of Stan, the meteorologist, wanted me to put a hurricane in there. And I said, no, I just want it to be an average day in London, or somewhere down the South End or something. It doesn't really matter. The whole point of it is it's actually, it's every day, but in a way it's extraordinary because it's every day. So these are that. And they're going up to Edinburgh to be shown quite soon in the RSA, if anybody's interested in seeing them in the flesh. They look quite different in the flesh than they do in documentation. So they're not in a kind of, they're actually etched inside. So there's a sort of fish, ship in a bottle kind of quality to it. How did it get there?
How does it get there?
Well, I have a studio up the road off Walworth Road, and I was really keen to get clouds from NASA or some kind of fantastic point cloud data, as it happens to be called, actually, when you use lasers to get data. But actually, when you shine a laser, aim it at something which is shiny, it goes crazy. It sort of does all sorts of things. So I actually made the clouds in my studio and scanned them with a laser in the Royal College where I teach. And so there's a bit of artistic license. So it's not, I don't mind that. I'm quite interested in, when you make decisions, it's not about sort of accuracy. The scales are all wrong. There's all sorts of stuff. But it's kind of about the quality of it, the sort of sense of it.
And then is it laser cut?
Actually, I'm getting another piece made for a show in Paris, just coming off, which is about wave formations. It's done outside of Paris, in a company called Diffraction. Who's, fortunately for me, because my French is appalling, is run by an English guy. So that's it there. And more work I've made about the body, which again is also, I wouldn't call myself a glass artist or anything like that. I'm more interested in the idea of using glass because of its kind of psychological intensity, particularly in this piece, and also because it's optical clarity, like in the cloud piece. It allows you to look but not touch. You can see, but you can't feel it. So it's about the idea of looking and you circumnavigating it and it creating a kind of tension around it. And this is a piece I made about lungs and the organ of air and how, we all fortunately have lungs in varying capacities of sort of health. But the point is that, by seeing them, in a way, it's one of the entries into the body. and it kind of affects thought, which has been another of my preoccupations, was making work about the brain. So I made this piece, which is made of the kind of glass that scientists use, Pyrex, borosilicate. In the good old days, I think people would be working away in a chemistry lab, but nowadays it's done elsewhere, I think. So that's it there, yeah. And that's another piece. I'm conscious of time, actually. Maybe that's enough to show just now, do you think?
We can come back.
We can come back,
we can come back to more if there's ones that you want to show. Thank you, Annie. Brilliant. Really beautiful work. There's so many things which I want to talk about now in the half an hour that we've got left. You were talking about with the works which were inspired by the sunlight recorder, Campbell Stoke's
That's
recorder.
right. Yeah.
And you were talking about you said that I like the rhythm and the movement in the images, and that. Partly because of this context, because we're in a dance studios where people's business often is working with movement and rhythm, and because of stilled, because in stilled the challenge in making these pinhole photographs, and maybe I will just very quickly show one, is that the bodies which are in these images are bodies which are moving. It's called stilled because in order to become visible on the photos, the performers need to be still. And the game that we play is the game of them choosing to not be still and to move. And that relationship between stillness and movement is what, in exactly the same way that you were talking about with the process of trying to capture an image through crystallography, the stillness or the not stillness totally affects the image which comes out of the performance. So this is somebody, this is a body. This is a body in movement. I haven't gone full screen, but never mind. Clearly somebody who was not being very stilled at this point. Or there. Whereas this body is more present. This one is not.
Are they more present because they're still?
Yeah, exactly. So I thought it would be interesting to talk a little bit about partly the rhythm of images. I think that's really interesting because it sounds choreographic, the rhythm of your work. And I like that you talk about your work in that language as a visual artist, and any more movement and rhythmical connections we can make to crystallography would be grand too.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective that rhythm's incredibly important because it's there in things like clouds. I mean, even when it's dark outside and we're all asleep, hopefully, the clouds are still moving and forming above us. And in a way, I'm trying to allude to other kinds of rhythms and the lungs with the kind of breathing and things which are happening no matter what, hopefully, if everything's going according to plan. And if they're not, then that's usually when things go wrong, actually. And that idea that the cycle's bigger than perhaps we're aware of, wheels within wheels within wheels. And I suppose in a way that's a sort of a kind of slight belief system for me anyway. Goes beyond sort of the political or the, I like the idea that the clouds that are above us may end up over a country we're at war with and may end up, you know what I mean? It doesn't really matter. This piece I'm making for a show actually with Kate Farwell is about the length of the water, what they call the fetch, which is the energy which goes along the Atlantic Ocean and ends up kind of on the coast of Orkney where they're making renewable energy from it. So the idea that something could go from the East Coast or Canada right through and sort of, nominally it's not absolutely accurately going to happen, but this idea that something can travel that far beyond boundaries, beyond sort of political things, it's just something I found very sort of interesting.
And you were just talking about bodies as well and your interest in bodies, and what really struck me, X-ray crystallography, there's something about the very name of the discipline that sounds quite hard-edged. Crystals they don't feel very, on first thinking, they don't immediately make you think of flesh and blood and bodies and what it means to be human and moving in the world. But actually, I think, is it right, especially in your particular your work and your focus is absolutely on discovering the hidden structures of our bodies and our flesh and
That's
everything
right.
inside them.
So we really want to understand how humans and other organisms work so that we can understand how to treat diseases. But you're right. Physics is a cold, hard science, and everyone looks at it and says that how are you going to relate this to people? But we hope that we relate it to people in the way that the outcome of what we do is important. But getting back to the motion thing, we have a bit of a dichotomy, because what we want is our crystals or our molecules to stay as still as possible, because we see more spots and we can learn more detail about what they look like. But then again, when something is just standing still, we don't know how it works, and we have to guess how it works. So in fact, we also want things to be mobile or not still. So having something that moves, although we can't see exactly where it is nearly as well, but we can see how it works. So if we were pumping something, a water pump, say an old-fashioned water pump, if you just had a picture of it, you wouldn't know how it worked. But if you could see it in motion, you could understand how it works. And so we have this mixture of things. The more we can see about what it looks like, the less we can understand how it moves and works.
Interesting.
It's a heck of a contradiction.
Yes, it is.
I'm mindful of the time too, and I am remembering my promise to not make you wait right till the end before you could join in with our conversation. So we could take a little moment to have a chat together. If you want to ask any questions or respond to anything or take us in a different direction. And if not, I'll take us in a different direction. Yeah, brilliant. And remember the microphone. Thank you.
If I'd like to ask a question to Annie. When Bonnie was describing the X-ray crystallography, and I was thinking of the word wonder, that you were kind of evoking that sense of, the first time, and I was thinking, as an artist, what you bring to maybe science, which is quite hard, maybe, or which feels about answers, as opposed to maybe questions or sitting in that state of wonder. How you balance that as someone working in a scientific context. I guess you're alone as an artist, kind of bringing something else to that context, and how you kind of play with those two sides.
Well, I think it's a really interesting territory, because I have a lot of time for scientific illustration, but I don't want to do that. But I think it's really interesting how scientists kind of visualize what they do, and it's a very difficult balance to strike. I mean, I don't think I get it right all the time, but I try to. I mean, that's the aim, is to try and take it into something else, make it have a different sort of meaning. And I think the interesting thing is to suggest. I'm not interested in being didactic. I'm just interested in suggesting. And one of the things that the scientists do so fantastically well is they show things to us that we would never know or see or understand. I mean, if I saw, it's so beautiful that, but I wouldn't, if I looked at it, I wouldn't know what on earth it is. I mean, the X-ray crystallography, there's a lovely symmetry, there's a gorgeous sort of depth to it. Things are in and out of focus, they have gorgeous tones, and I can take it on an aesthetic level. But when someone like Bonnie can describe it to me in a way that gives it this whole other meaning and implication, it just adds all sorts of other dimensions to it, which are, sort of make it completely three-dimensional in every way. So for me, that's one of my loves of going, and was one of my favourite things when I was at the Royal Institution, was just going to the lectures, And obviously there is a huge emphasis, I think, nowadays on scientists making their science sort of more understandable to people. And, I think that's fabulous for everybody, actually. I think it's really interesting.
Respect from both sides.
Yeah.
Art and science, that kind of working together to kind of make this understanding more holistic, maybe.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
Yeah, I mean, I think you know, it's everything is to do with context, really, isn't it? I mean, I can show a piece which I haven't shown yet, which I showed as a result of working with neuroscientists. I've shown it in a department in Oxford University. I showed it in a gallery which used to be a swimming pool for Nazis during the war, which has been made into a gallery now. And the same piece has been shown, and it just conjures up different things depending on the way you look at it. It's exactly the same piece, but it's you know, it's in another context. So I think there's something in that too, which is quite interesting. Whether I make a piece that stands up in somewhere like the Wellcome Trust, you know, in a show, or if I could take that piece and put it into a gallery in Paris or New York, and whether people go, yes, but I need to know the science to understand this. I mean, I'm of the kind of predisposition, I suppose, where I feel that it needs to be enough on its own. But it's always interesting to have more information, but it needs to stand alone. It needs to not have to have a whole kind of thing, unless the work was about that, and my work isn't. Other people's is, and that's fine. It's not a criticism, but it's not the way I work. And I'm really interested in re-representation, how you bring something from one world into another, or how you bring something that you think you know and re-represent it, allow you to see it afresh and anew. I think that's quite interesting. I find it quite interesting. Anyway.
I think also it's really, for me, important to kind of clock, as you did, the fact that it was Bonnie who introduced the idea of wonder into us talking, and that, you know, I was saying about when we first had the commission to make Stilled, and part of what I was doing was trying to find connections between this piece, which I was discovering I wanted to make as an artwork, and at the same time trying to work out why I was making that in response to a commission about X-ray crystallography, which was not anything I'd ever thought about making a piece about, you know. And one of the things, and doing some historical research about maybe the earlier years of the discipline, when it was much more analogue, which was you were talking about earlier, working with photographic paper wrapped around the apparatus which contained the crystal, rather than a bank of computers, which I think is what you work with now, hence the photography connection. But the particular thing that I want to talk about now was, I had the sense from the research that I was doing that, having made these photographic images of the dots and marks that Bonnie's been talking about, that there was at some point, for those scientists who were looking at these images, a kind of a leap of imagination and a leap of creativity, a creative leap of going, I kind of have a sense of what this is, but I'm not quite sure. But if I just imagine that it's this, what would then happen in terms of my kind of more formal analysis of that? And I love the fact that at the very heart and in the history of this scientific process, which led to this artwork and this talk with an artist in this building, actually, that the wonder and the ability to imagine and the significance of being able to imagine something which you know nothing about is what scientists do. It's not the province of artists at all. It's all of our provinces, but it seemed, so I was very glad that you talked about wonder before Annie or I got it in, because I love that you wonder at things still, you know, so absolutely. Far into your career. It's brilliant. Anyway, thank you. I think we'll come back. Oh, is there another? Okay. We'll have a chat, and then we'll talk again for a little while.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. I had a question which was related to processes, which I guess is sort of more for Bonnie and David, but you might want to answer as well. I don't know. Which is about when you're producing these images, so either your crystallography images or in this case the pinhole camera images, whether how you might assess successful and failed images, and whether you feel that that's something that you do similarly or differently. I mean, I don't know how you selected the images which are downstairs, and I imagine that what qualifies as a interesting or successful image has all kinds of facets in your work. But I mean, that was a sort of general,
Well, for us, it is the dichotomy of the more spots that we saw on that picture, the more I can tell you in detail, but the less I can tell you about how it works. And so I want to know both. And somehow it's the leap of imagination of trying to jump between the two and imagine how this thing that I can see a lot of works in this way. And so that's how success is normally in the field of crystallography per se. As a physicist, the success is in defining the detail with more spots. But if I'm a biologist and I want to know how things work, the success is in the less spots that tell me how things move. So I wear two hats, you see.
I think for me it's interesting because so if that means that for you obviously you have this search for accuracy and a kind of a precision of the knowledge that you can generate through your process and the images that come out of that process. But in some ways for me, the mark of a successful image is one that's not too accurate. I'm least interested in the photos which are of people standing still and which are visibly bodies in stillness. For me, the whole process of making them is totally unpredictable. I have a sense of how much exposure time an image might need in relation to how brightly lit or not brightly lit a performer is at any one point, which then becomes a slice of time rather than a moment. I mean, these photos take between, I think the shortest exposure time is about 4 or 5 minutes and the longest is 60 minutes. So there's a massive range also to do with people's capacity for remaining still. It is possible for a dancer to remain beautifully and totally still for 5 minutes or so, but for an hour, I think actually it's quite challenging for anybody. And so I have a sense of what might come out in terms of what bodies might be visible or not, but I'm almost always surprised by the image that does come out of the camera. And for me, the mark of an interesting image is one which has a very strong sense of the time it contains, actually, a sense of the temporalness of the image rather than the surface of the image. Actually, I'm more interested in the chunk of time that's behind it, in the process, I suppose. And one image is where there is a demand of a kind of interpretation from the viewer, because that again makes me think of those early crystallographers trying to figure out what something meant. And I want, both for myself and for people looking at those photos, I want a need to spend some time going, what is that? Is that a back, or is that actually part of the floor, or is it just an aberration caused by the light, and does it matter? And if it's any of those things, then what's everything else in that image? And so yeah, there's some criteria to do with failed images, which I like a lot, actually.
The interesting thing about that is when I first saw the performance, when you did it down at the South Bank Center, I was fascinated by it. And I, as a scientist, tried to predict what all the pictures would look like as people were. And I was wrong most of the time, but I was greatly gratified when I actually guessed so I stayed to watch what all the developed photographs looked like and then tried to match them up with what I had guessed they would be. So in one sense, it's the same process, but sort of backwards, the way we looked at it.
And of course in that, in the process that you've just described, there is something to do with memory and the memory of a live event, and then how these images might confirm that memory or contradict that memory. And at the heart of still is an interest in time and how you visualize time. And I know that that's something, Annie, that in many of your works you've been concerned with. And I'd like us to talk a little bit about that. Either in relation to memory or in relation to the duration of time, and how as an artist or as a scientist you try and visualize something which is not fixed, I guess.
Not fixed. Well, there is a piece that I was going to show if there'd been more time, but it's maybe the last one. Just whip to the end.
Shall I whip to the end?
Very end, yeah. And it was a piece, I was asked to make a piece which was in this was me getting my brain scan. I was going to talk a bit about that, but another time. But a piece I made, I was asked to make a piece for a forest, and I thought at first, I don't really do that kind of work. I'd sort of defined myself as somebody who makes work for, this is it. And the only way I could do it was really getting immersed in the culture of the place. And this is the Forest of Dean, and I put these images in because this is the free miners, and what they do is they dig under the ground, and they have the right to mine. And I was really interested in that idea that people having this right to mine. And I suppose I was thinking about the surface of the earth in relationship to the surface of the skin, which I'd been very interested in going in underneath. So I looked at all these maps of people who'd, the mining community have, and looked at this geology underneath, and I didn't get this, but the Forestry Commission scans the area for all sorts of reasons, for archaeological reasons, and this kind of, so it's a similar kind of understanding of scanning and
this sweeping of light.
Sweeping of light across to get data, and I was just going to put that in. Again, I went from that. I chose this area, which was a quarry, and I tried to find the house or or whatever had been built from the quarry, but with no luck. So I got the place scanned myself 3-dimensionally, because I thought if we scanned the whole quarry, which was a little like a kind of amphitheatre, it was a natural kind of amphitheatre, then maybe I could kind of make a ball of it and make the kind of negative space into a positive space. But in the end, you saw that red line around it, I just thought, no, I've got to cast it. So this incredible stone, which was in the Super Pangaea, was down on the Mediterranean. It moved up very slowly, very different timeline, 310 million years, something like that. I think it was 310 million years. Moved up, was now in, Forest of Dean, Gloucestershire. So we ended up casting it in this kind of analogue way. But the scanning of it allowed me to think 3-dimensionally. I'm interested in the way that you have this, Bonnie, perhaps two, maybe more, but the way that you've described it, 2 different understandings of the same thing. And I was scanning it, and then at the same time trying to understand the space like that, and I could see it on the computer from treetops down, and I could look at it in all sorts of ways, and we could rotate it and turn it inside out. And that made me come up with the idea of casting it, and then if we carry on, we casted it and put it back in, and put it back in so that you could compare it to where it came from. And then if you carry on round, it was like an extrusion. And then I cast the positive as a negative. So you saw inside from the other side, and that was what the other information allowed me to do, was to think about this from the inside and the interior. And actually through time, that the one that was very accurate on the front was kind of slightly interesting, because you were looking at it and then looking at where it came from. But through time, spending time working there and installing it, I became much more interested in the back bit, which was all the reverse and seeing the whole piece in reverse. But it showed different timelines. It showed the stone. It showed, I think, if you could carry on there, if you can just see that side bit at the top, that's actually just soil with pine needles on it. So it's just very movable. If you'd poked your finger in, you could have left a sort of hole in it, as it were. So I wanted to kind of, in a way, unify those timelines and make the stone as important as the soil, as the little pine needles and everything, and freeze that moment in time. And in a way, although it's very sort of accurate, it feels a little bit like the kind of idea of a trace and a touch. Definitely a touch. It's a complete kind of haptic piece which came from that. And now if you go there are bits that have changed of the landscape, and that has actually been weathered because people clamber all over it. Get the photograph taken on top, apparently. But irrespective of that, it's more sort of stationary. And I think if you're in a forest for a long time, I don't know if you ever spent time in one, but being from the centre of London, where I'm used to sound all the time, and being in a forest, I could hear things cracking and moving, and I was sort of very slightly kind of frightened, actually. And I thought, God, I live, near Brixton and Peckham. What am I on about? So I had to go through all that, about being in a forest and being fearful of those kind of things, which I thought was quite interesting as well. Being there, I've always loved that film, Being There, with Peter Sellers. It's about that being in the moment in time. And it's quite an important film. That it's a sort of humorous film, but it's also very serious at the same time, about innocence. So
this piece contains at least 350 million years worth of time.
It's been cast from that, yeah. And I found that just something that you just walk past. You wouldn't even notice. So I suppose it's also what I'm trying to do is to say, notice things. if anything, notice things which aren't important, but notice things, or at least I think that's suggesting it to notice, not notice this, but just to sort of look again, you know.
I think trying to see things which go unseen
Well,
feels
and
very central
yeah.
to all of what we
You know,
do.
how you look really interests me. How on earth you know that a spot like that is of enormous significance? It's just incredible, you know. It goes well beyond forensic science for me.
But it's an observation thing
Yeah.
that we're all doing and manifesting it in different ways.
Yeah.
I'm aware of it being 5 to 8, so let's open up again. If you have any more thoughts. If you'd like to make a brilliant conclusion to save me from trying to have to do it, that would be good. Any more questions? If not, we can talk for 5 more minutes. Getting a nod from the back, yes, talk for 5 more minutes. There's something about scale which keeps coming up. I mean, you know, we talk about time scales and that kind of physical metaphor for the passing of time, you know, and this time scale of hundreds of millions of years, or the time scales that operate within still of a few minutes to a few hours max. The longest performance we've done is 12 hours, so it's long in performance terms, but quite inconsequential in terms of geological time or, you know, any other extended kind of time. But scale seems, maybe we can finish by talking about scale, because you work with the most tiny things, the shortest wavelengths, the literally invisible substances that can't be analysed with the naked eye, and you're working both sculpturally, sometimes on a much larger scale, but also in terms of time. Maybe we can talk about scale and anything to do with time in crystallography, because I know we haven't ever talked about that, and I don't know if there's a temporal aspect which...
Well, there is, because it takes a certain amount of time to see that spot. So you have to put a certain number of X-rays in. So depending on where you get your X-rays from, it can take hours to get a few spots, or it can take milliseconds to get a few spots, depending if you use a small instrument that you might have in your own lab, or the biggest instruments in the world to do it, such as the one that the UK has built out in Oxfordshire called Diamond Light Source, which is, when they built it, the neighbors thought that they were building a football stadium, and they were sorely disappointed when they heard it was going to be a big physics operation. But it dwarfs, it's probably roughly on the size of Wembley Stadium or so. And through there, you send these minutely small wavelengths of light around and around and around. And because you do it, and you speed them up, and there's an awful lot of them, instead of taking hours that we might do in our lab, you can expose a piece of film like that in a millisecond.
Yeah.
So it's all a matter of scale. Small things, long time; big things, short time. Physicists like big things.
I was going to ask what happens when you've gone through those thresholds of 12 hours. I mean, does the piece, how does it evolve? Does it change? Are there many surprises?
Yeah, it does change, and it's really interesting to be in an experience with a group of people, whether it's me as the photographer or the performers or us with an audience. Spending a number of hours together, it's really just observing how one experiences time differently when you're really focused on it is very interesting. So I get used to time passing in chunks of either 6 or 50 minutes, because with the biggest cameras that I use, generally, although it sometimes can take longer, it takes about 50 minutes to get some kind of picture, and the smallest cameras generally take about 5 or 6 minutes. So a 12-hour performance for me can go quite quickly, because that only means 15 big pictures. And it's a very, very different kind of experience of time, where you're actually observing it passing, partly through the cameras, but partly biologically as well, just by being present in a space with some other people and being together, rather than necessarily by this. It's a funny contradiction, because it's very much about the kind of timing of, okay, that's the 6 minutes up, tick it off in my book, and that one's done. That kind of linear time, but also living through something that feels more organic.
Do you notice any differences in the kind of photographs that you get at the beginning of the 12-hour session and at the end of the 12-hour session. So have you ever compared them to see if there's more motion and more spots?
Yeah, they certainly become more playful because we have a kind of a repertoire of things that will keep us going for that long. So I end up inevitably starting to move a little bit myself with the cameras. It's not just about the subject moving or being still, but also becomes about the apparatus moving or being still and the consequences of that. So we tend to get better images towards the end, actually, because there's a kind of a relaxation into what it is and getting over the anxiety of starting a show, you know. Like, oh, we're starting a show now as an audience, and then after 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 or 12 hours, you can't sustain that anxiety, so you're just in it, and so it becomes more about the being in the process and seeing and wondering what happens and being surprised. So I think we might stop there with an idea of wondering and being surprised. Thanks very much.